Hey everybody, it's Ron again with the Safety Tribe. I had an interesting question posed to me recently, and I just thought I'd share this with you guys in the form of a video. The question is, are all industry consensus standards mandatory under OSHA? That is, can OSHA enforce an industry consensus standard that's not a federal regulation? So the answer to this question, the short answer, there's two short answers. One is yes and one is maybe. First, let's talk a little bit about what is an industry consensus standard. An industry consensus standard is a standard adopted by an independent organization that's not part of the federal government or a state government. And this independent organization makes decisions as to what kind of things should be done a certain way. For example, color coding for pipes. There's an industry consensus standard for color coding for pipes. But the federal government doesn't have a standard for that, so there is such a thing as an industry consensus standard. And the question would be, is this standard enforceable by OSHA? So once again, there's two answers to that question, yes and maybe. For the yes answer, I refer you to the OSHA regulations 1910.6 and 1926.6 for the construction part of it. And what happens in these two regulations is that OSHA has gone in and incorporated by reference dozens of industry consensus standards. That is, they'll take that consensus standard and say, okay, now this is mandatory. What that means is that any mandatory provision of a consensus standard that's listed in one of these regulations has the same weight. If there's a word shall used or other mandatory language, that carries the same weight as if it was a specific federal regulation. So OSHA can come, and if they want to, they can cite you against any mandatory requirement in any industry consensus standard, just like it was a regulation. So it's pretty clear that you can be cited by OSHA for a violation of an industry consensus standard. So that's the yes answer part of the question. Now for the maybe answer. Not all industry consensus standards are referenced or incorporated into the OSHA regulatory structure. That means OSHA hasn't said that they're going to enforce those. So they can choose, however, whether they want to enforce them or not. The way they can do this is because of a clause in the OSHA Act called the General Duty Clause. That General Duty Clause says it's the employer's responsibility to control all recognized hazards. And in OSHA's view, if there's an industry consensus standard or other regulation, for example, a maritime regulation, that says you should do a certain thing a certain way or shall do a certain thing a certain way, OSHA has the option of citing you for that. My favorite example of this is OSHA's habit or propensity to cite businesses for standing or leaning forklift pallets. There is no regulation or industry consensus standard that's been adopted that says a standing or leaning forklift pallet is a violation. At least there's not one in the 1910 or 1926 regulations. There is, however, one in the maritime regulations. So OSHA can come in, and they have done this many times, and you've got a standing forklift pallet like the one in the photograph that you just saw. And this forklift pallet is standing there, and the OSHA's like, well, that could fall and hurt somebody, so that's a hazard. And because it's mentioned in another standard, it's a recognized hazard, so you have to control it. And OSHA can fine you, and has done this many times, $3,000 to $4,000 to $5,000 for a pallet that's standing up. And they do this under what's called the general duty clause. So the bottom line here is that we are vulnerable to citations for failure to control any recognized hazard, whether it's specifically in a regulation, whether it's in an adopted industry consensus regulation, or any other source. If it's what OSHA considers a recognized hazard, they feel like they can cite us for it. That's the way that works. Thank you, and y'all keep watching, and if you've got ideas for things that you'd like to have commented on, just put something into the comments, and I'll read those, and if it looks pretty interesting, well, I'll make a video on it. So thank you, and keep coming back.